And we're back now with some of Washington's best. Ruth Marcus, a columnist for the Washington Post. David Sanger, national security correspondent for the New York Times. Nancy Youssef with the Daily Beast, and John Harris, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Politico. And Nancy, I want to start with you. You were out in the Middle East for so long working for McClatchy. You've been to all of these places. I want to ask you about this idea that ISIS recruiting jihadis at nearly the same rate that we are killing them. Do you believe that's right? And where does that go? How do we counter that?
Well, the U.S. military said that they've killed 6,000, roughly, since the air campaign began in August. And in that time, independent groups have said 4,000 have come in even since October. Remember, the campaign began in August. And so it seems that they're able to keep up at the rate that they are being killed. Now, the interesting thing is the military doesn't have a means to really accurately count those numbers because they don't have troops on the ground, and neither do the groups who are giving these numbers. But the results are the same, which is that they're able to recruit. And one of the reasons is, as we see these barbaric videos, to us it is so obvious that this group should not have any appeal. But for so many in the region, this idea of forming an Islamic caliphate, the oppression and the suffering that they endure at home has made it such that the ISIS message somehow resonates with them, that there should be a caliphate, that an Islamic State would take care of their poverty, would take care of their interpretation of religion, that there's such frustration with the state from which they live under, that the Islamic State is an alternative. In Iraq, for example, the appeal is in part because they reject their Shia-dominated government.
David, you've been dealing with this for a long time. Do you think the killing of this Jordanian pilot could somehow backfire here? Obviously, it has inflamed the people of Jordan. I mean, I think we're seeing a wholly different story in the streets, so to speak, at least in Jordan right now.
You have seen a big pendulum swing in Jordan, and you actually have seen the government in Jordan try to sort of fan those flames with this very big protest that they had in Memorial. The problem is Jordan is a tiny state that doesn't have a whole lot of resources to go contribute to this fight. And you've seen great reluctance on the part of other Arab states to really stick with it. And the United Arab Emirates just recently came back in, starting up flights again after they had suspended them after the shoot down. I think many of them are waiting for a greater sign from Washington about how much backup they're going to get. And that's why that clip that you showed before of Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, was so interesting, because there's sort of one worldview. The critique of President Obama is that he's not paying attention as the lines are being redrawn in Ukraine, as ISIS gets more powerful, that there's a collapse of old world order here. And then you have the view that you heard from Ms. Rice the other day, where she basically said, these are discrete problems that we can handle. We're the unchallenged superpower. The problem is they haven't sent clear signals about how much commitment the U.S. is willing to make.
Well, John, and you're the master of politics and covered it probably as much as anybody. This whole idea of there is a kind of a notion, and you heard Mike McCall talk about it, said the administration is just not taking this seriously enough.
There's a perception that the world's on fire, and there's enough fires going on to make that a legitimate perception. To go to what David said, is the administration is trying to not be buffeted by these series of individual crises, and basically claiming that they're not linked. The administration came out with its national security strategy the other day. Remember, about a year ago, there was this big storm. President Obama was criticized even by Hillary Clinton for saying his strategy is don't do stupid stuff, or maybe even a different word than stuff, was how he said it privately. This is actually the articulation of that. He calls for strategic patience. And it's basically, look, we can't be everywhere. We've got to just have a detachment on this. The problem with that is not just our enemies, but our allies see detachment as indifference and lack of willpower. And Obama, he clearly gets drawn in every instance late to the conclusion that force is what matters, not just diplomacy and engagement. Hillary Clinton, by the way, is going to have a big problem reconciling this because she's much more on the force and intervention side.
I think John is exactly right. The president's instincts are patience, whether it may be strategic or not. Sometimes too much patience can be a very dangerous thing. And so I was very struck by the panel you had on, two people who worked with this president very closely, Mike Morrell and Tom Donilon, who, yes, there are not existential threats to the United States as we had during the Cold War, but the serious outbreak of problems, not just the Islamic State, but the others that they rattled off, and the potential dangers, not just to the region in the Mideast, but to the homeland that could pose, and the state of play in the Mideast. Yes, we have started, maybe we have some progress in Iraq. I was very struck by the degree to which Tom Donilon did not mention any progress in Syria, because that's really pretty late to the game. So I'm not sure patience is warranted right now.
Nancy, after all those years you spent out in the region, how is President Obama and American leadership viewed in that part of the world?
Well, anything carries the patina of the Iraq. Any view has the patina of the Iraq War and how the war started and also how it ended. On top of that, you have now Arab Spring, where there was a feeling, I can say, for example, in Egypt, that the president spoke out on behalf of the protesters a little late, when it was inevitable that former President Hosni Mubarak would fall. And then when they said that the elected President Morsi must stay, that the U.S. is endorsing the Muslim Brotherhood rather than the process of a democratic election. And so the feeling is that the United States is sort of taking a limited view, one that looks strictly at their interests and isn't really engaged enough to take on these very intractable problems. Now, that all said, I think one of the differences that came out of Arab Spring was that these were seen much more as local issues rather than constructs of the United States, whereas in the before, the leadership of Mubarak, for example, was seen as propped up by the United States. It's now Sisi, the current president, is seen as an organic product of the circumstances on the ground. So it's been a shift.
What would you add to that, David?
Well, I thought the best part of the national security strategy that John referred to before was that in its first couple of pages, it prioritized when the United States would have to go get involved. And it started with the natural ones, that when there's a threat directly to the United States homeland, threats to Americans, and so forth. Where I think it ran into trouble is not acknowledging how quickly we've gotten into a situation where what seem to be regional threats can turn into threats to us. So just as Afghanistan became the breeding ground for al-Qaeda, the big fear about Syria now is that if it splits up, it becomes sort of the next Afghanistan. And then we ask the question, were we in enough and early enough? And that's why you see this big debate about whether or not we're actually secretly trying to keep Assad in for fear that the country will implode. You're seeing it again in Ukraine, where the issue is to what degree do we arm the rebels, and there is a big split out here, not only between the Europeans and the U.S., but even in the administration. You heard Ash Carter, the nominee for Secretary of Defense, say he was inclined to arm them.
Well, I want to talk about the Ukraine in just a minute, but I want to get back to this. What are we trying to do in Syria? I'm not sure I understand what we're trying to do there.
Well, the official position is that the airstrikes, frankly, what the U.S. is doing is serving as a sort of air force, if you will, for the Kurdish forces and the territories that they're trying to protect, and the Iraqi army and the territories that they're trying to protect, because they simply don't have the air power to do it, and it's an area where you can dominate over the Islamic State. Now, the U.S. position is that it cannot send ground forces in. It has to be a local force that does it, and it'll be months and months of training before they can reach that point. So many argue that it's a strategy of containment, and frankly, it's hard to see how far the U.S. could go in such a way to really change the dynamics on the ground, because they're so fluid. And the groups that we would have aligned with a few years ago are now aligned with al-Qaeda. So picking allies in that region has become very, very complicated. I think there's a fair argument to be made that it's a containment strategy. I just want to go back to one point that David made. You know, one of the case studies in terms of the strategy that's written and what's carried out is Libya, where the U.S. said it wouldn't get involved unless it was direct threat, got involved, and we saw the repercussions of that is now arguably a threat not only to the region but to the United States, as so many ISIS fighters.
It's one where the president said he's had some regrets.
Yeah. Right. And you know, Nancy makes a interesting point about there's a lot of woulda, coulda, shoulda on Syria and elsewhere about what might have happened and the potential much more flexibility to make progress that we could have had if we had intervened earlier. And that actually brings me to John's point about Hillary Clinton. And you posed it a little bit, John, as a potential problem for Secretary Clinton in terms of separating herself from President Obama's policies, I actually think it could be a benefit to her, because unlike when she ran 8 years ago, she is not facing challenges from the left of the party with people worrying that she's a little bit too interventionist. But it really sets her apart in a way that I think could set her up very nicely for a general election campaign, differentiating herself from President Obama. And there's an interesting parallel debate on the Republican side, the strains between the more isolationist Rand Paul parts of the party and the more interventionist parts. So I think this is going to be a really interesting and vibrant part of the presidential debate coming as well.
And unlike sometimes where these are kind of manufactured debates or matters of manipulation to not get on the wrong side of the issue, I think this flows very genuinely from what Hillary Clinton actually believes. Her instincts are much more interventionist, much more of a believer of diplomacy backed by force than President Obama.
And the one thing we know is this is for sure going to be the next president's problem, no matter who he or she is.
You know, one thing that kind of struck me this week when the president, we all knew he was going to do this. He said last year he was going to do it. He was going to ask the new Congress to give him formal authority to fight this war against ISIS and Al Qaeda. And you know, we've been hearing the Republicans say, you know, he's got to be stronger. He's got to go after him. And then the response from John Boehner was, well, this is going to be a heavy lift. I mean, what is going on here? Is the Congress, are they going to deny him the right to carry out this fight?
Yeah, it's a mother may I sort of step out here. Okay, so nobody wants to be the first one to initiate the authorization for force, because they've had a few cases where authorizations to use force have blown up on them in the past, including in Iraq. So the Republicans are playing a game here, I think, in which they want to say the president's been too weak, but they don't necessarily want to go on record with a vote that indicates that they're giving this president or this president's successor the kind of blank check that George Bush had at some point. Because they know in a lot of constituencies there's a sense that the United States just got out of 2 wars and we don't want to get back in.
Bob, both parties, I would say, have a division between elite ranks, what thinkers, national security strategists, high officials tend to think, if they're on truth serum, what should we really think, versus where the country at both ends of the ideological spectrum is weary of war, skeptical of our ability to really make a difference, even if we wanted to. So President Obama is probably closer to the mood of the country than the people who are saying, look, we've got to do something, the world's on fire, we need a more aggressive response.
And everybody pretty much thinks that we need to update the authorization. What the precise contours of that are, much less agreement. But especially as we wind down the war in Afghanistan, one important thing to start thinking about is what will be our authority legally to hold people who were caught on the battlefield in Afghanistan at Guantanamo, if or elsewhere, if that war is ended. What is the law of war justification? It sounds like a really wonky point, but it could be very important.
I want to go back to what David brought up about Ukraine. The German leader, Angela Merkel, coming here. I think she's coming tomorrow. She's already said, no, we shouldn't be arming the Ukrainian folks. The United States actively considering that. Is this a breach between Germany and the United States? And if so, is that something to be concerned about?
Well, there's one that is certainly developing, and it's not just Germany. It's both the German chancellor and the French president both went to see President Putin at the end of last week. They presented a program that we don't fully understand, but is essentially an extension of the ceasefire with a little bit more of a carved out region for the Russian oriented areas of the country. But the problem is that they've said that even if Putin doesn't accept that, they're not going to favor arming the Ukrainian government. So Putin's looking at this and saying, well, what's the downside of just dragging for time here, which is what he's done very successfully as this has gotten into a bigger and bigger conflict. The president's instinct is not necessarily to go in, I think, and many in his party agree. But as I mentioned, you've heard Ash Carter. I think you'll probably have to hear from Hillary Clinton on this issue pretty soon at some point. And it's going to be a very big division because in the end, you heard Vice President Biden say yesterday that the reset was over and we're into a period of resistance to the Russians. That's different than saying confrontation.
It seems to me the central question is, if the U.S. were to give the Ukrainian army more weapons, would that prolong this conflict, or would it push the Russians to back away, making it maybe too costly for them, either politically or economically? If the answer is no, and the Russians continue to get involved, what is the second and third order effects? Must the U.S. then get more involved? Is it ready to get more involved on something that the president has essentially called a regional issue?
All right, well, we're going to stop there. I want to thank all of you for being with us. We'll be back with a look at the wacky weather of the weekend.